During the World Economic Forum's Davos summit earlier this year, Alibaba president Michael Evans revealed that the elites are working on an individual carbon credit score for consumers, i.e. you and me. As it turns out, many countries around the world have been researching and developing individual carbon credit scores for over a decade, and it looks like they're on the brink of being rolled out. That's why today I'm going to tell you everything you need to know about this upcoming dystopian system, including why it's being implemented, when it could be implemented, and how you can prepare. Now, I want to start with a confession, and that is that I don't know where to start. We've gone down many rabbit holes when researching cryptocurrencies, central bank digital currencies, digital IDs, and other such topics, but the rabbit hole of individual carbon credit scores takes the term to another level. Okay, so the history of individual carbon credit scores seems to begin with the United Nations' first Earth Summit, which was held in the Brazilian city of Rio de Janeiro in 1992. Now, this summit was significant because it laid the groundwork for the collective climate action of the countries in the UN. Later that year, UN countries signed the Kyoto Protocol, an international agreement to reduce and eventually eliminate carbon emissions to fight climate change. As of 2020, 192 countries have signed up to the Kyoto Protocol, which is basically the entire world. Now, what's interesting about the Kyoto Protocol is that it also laid the foundation for the issuance and trading of carbon credits. Now, I'll come back to carbon credits in a moment. All you need to know for now is that when the concept of carbon credits was introduced, it was intended for institutions, not individuals. Naturally, it didn't take long for the concept of carbon credits to be applied to individuals, though. It seems that the catalyst for this was a book called, quote, Our Ecological Footprint. It was written by a Swiss-born Canadian professor and so-called sustainability advocate named Mathis Wagernackel in the late 90s. To clarify, however, it wasn't this book that created the idea of an individual carbon credit. It was British Petroleum, or BP. The oil company used the concept of an individual carbon footprint for its massive marketing campaign in the early 2000s. It even created an individual carbon footprint calculator. Obviously, the purpose of these marketing campaigns was to blame climate change on consumers and not the corporations. After all, were it not for the demands of the consumer, then these corporations would not have to pollute as much as they do to provide the goods and services consumers crave. Nobody ever seems to mention that the overconsumption causing climate change is being driven by an inflationary monetary system which incentivizes everyone to spend rather than save. I digress. Now, around this time, the UN's first experiment in global governance, that is, global control, was in full swing. This experiment was called the Millennium Development Goals, which was established by the Millennium Summit in, you guessed it, the year 2000. The Millennium Development Goals, or MDGs, consisted of 8 goals that all 191 UN countries were supposed to achieve by 2015. These included things like eliminating poverty, combating deadly diseases, and environmental sustainability. It appears that BP's concept of an individual carbon footprint was something that the countries looking to meet their environmental MDGs found interesting. This is because the first wave of academic research about individual carbon credit scores emerged in the mid to late 2000s. In other words, it looks like some countries thought that creating an individual carbon credit score for their citizens would help them meet their MDGs. Take the UK, for instance. The British government created a legal framework for individual carbon credit scores way back in 2008. What's crazy is that, according to Wikipedia, quote, the Climate Change Act 2008 also grants powers allowing the UK government to introduce a personal carbon trading scheme without further primary legislation. Note that it's likely that similar laws are in place in other countries. Now, given that the concept of an individual carbon credit score has been around for well over a decade, This begs the question of why it's only now that we're starting to hear about it. Well, the answer seems to be because the UN's MDGs experiment failed. When 2015 came around, there was still no shortage of poverty, deadly diseases, and environmental issues plaguing the planet. Recall that 2015 is when the MDGs were supposed to be met, and although some progress was made, the experiment was mostly unsuccessful. Now, there are many reasons why the MDGs were never met, but they all seem to boil down to three things: a lack of funding, a lack of coordination, and the 2008 financial crisis, which threw many countries into chaos in the years that followed. The third factor easily affected the first two. That's why the UN decided to do something that every institution does when it fails: rebrand and try again. In 2015, the UN announced its second experiment in global control called the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which superseded the failed MDGs as per the UN's own website. I should note, however, that this transition didn't happen overnight. In 2012, the UN set up the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, or SDSN, to essentially figure out what went wrong with the MDGs and to make sure that the upcoming SDGs were implemented. Yes, we are getting into heavy acronym territory here, folks. Buckle up. Now, as a fun fact, the UN's SDSN seems to have very close connections to the mainstream media, as it is advised by Ted Turner. Ted is the founder of CNN and the founder of the United Nations Foundation, an American organization that seems to have significant influence at the UN. The more you know. Now, whereas the MDGs were supposed to be met by 2015, the SDGs are supposed to be met by 2030. While there were 8 MDGs, there are no less than 17 SDGs. The SDGs are the same as the MDGs, just with more extreme and vague language, probably to allow for interpretations with serious outcomes. The 17 SDGs are also part of a bigger plot by the UN called Agenda 2030, which I imagine most of you have heard about. Agenda 2030 includes lots of other exciting stuff, like the Tri-State City in the Netherlands. The only thing standing in the way of the Tri-State City is all those Dutch farmers. Good thing they'll be gone soon. In all seriousness, you can sum up the SDGs as being the MDGs, but on steroids. This is because the SDGs are backed by both the public sector and the private sector. The MDGs were backed almost entirely by the public sector, which is a big part of why there wasn't enough funding and next to no coordination. It's a different story when you have the private sector on board, however. Global corporations have no shortage of capital, and they're able to coordinate because their operations transcend borders. More importantly, they can ensure compliance with SDGs without governments having to pass any laws. If you watched our video about ESG, you'll know that the environmental, social and governance criteria that the world's largest institutions are using to guide their investments and operations are based on the SDGs. I reckon the end game is for ESG and SDGs to be one and the same. This begs a second question, however, and that's what exactly these global corporations stand to gain by achieving the SDGs through ESG. That's because many elements of ESG are fundamentally incompatible with the economic realities of supply and demand, something these global corporations know very well. In theory, the primary benefit of pushing SDGs through ESG is that it makes it possible for these global corporations to crush small competitors and acquire their assets. This is because it just won't be possible for small businesses to comply with ESG criteria, and some would say this is the entire purpose of ESG. The businesses that do manage to comply with ESG could still be denied funding on ESG grounds by the incumbent institutions. This is because ESG criteria are ultimately subjective, just like the SDGs. This means that whoever has the power to interpret these criteria can do so to their own benefit. Now, if you want evidence of this, look no further than Tesla, which was kicked off the S&P 500's ESG index despite being about as ESG as they come. If you watched our video about this year's World Economic Forum Summit in Davos, you'll know the ESG elites effectively shrugged their shoulders when confronted about this blatant bias. Now, as much of a killing that global corporations would make from crushing their small competitors and acquiring their assets through ESG, there is a limit to how lucrative this would be. That is simply because they will eventually succeed in acquiring all the resources and customers that exist. When that happens, these global corporations will be confronted with an economic reality that most of them are aware of, and that is demographic decline in developed countries. Each year, there are fewer and fewer consumers with the kind of capital that these global corporations need to continue growing. If you watched our video about why you will own nothing and be happy, you'll know that demographic decline is why these global corporations are slowly trying to make us rent everything instead of owning it. This makes products more accessible on a global scale and creates a constant stream of cash flow. However, even this hardware-as-a-service scheme would only last so long. Eventually, these global corporations will run out of people to rent their products to, and they'll once again be faced with the economic reality of demographic decline. What this means is that the primary benefit of pushing SDGs through ESG is temporary and short-lived. This is something that these global corporations know, and it brings us right back to the second question. What do these global corporations stand to gain by pushing SDGs through ESG? In practice, the primary benefit is that it makes it possible for these global corporations to create an economy where they continue to grow regardless of demographic decline. Now, this sounds impossible until you realize how carbon credits work. Now, I'll start by saying that I am by no means an expert on carbon credits, so if I make any major mistakes, please correct me in the comments section. That said, I know that each carbon credit gives its holder the right to emit 1 ton of carbon dioxide. This is because each carbon credit is supposed to represent 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions that were removed or were never emitted. This could be because a load of trees were planted in a forest, or because a load of solar panels were installed on a factory. When a company does something that removes carbon emissions or prevents future carbon emissions, such as the 2 things I just mentioned, they are given carbon credits by a governmental authority. These carbon credits are then sold to other companies that want to emit more carbon without penalty. What I just described is called the compliance carbon market, meaning that this kind of carbon credit issuance, trading and redemption is done because of environmental regulations. There are compliance carbon markets in California, Europe and China, and they account for 99% of all carbon credit trading. The remaining 1% of carbon credit trading happens in the voluntary carbon market. Now, the voluntary carbon market is where companies looking to emit more voluntarily purchase carbon credits from companies voluntarily looking to emit less. This is of course done to increase their ESG scores. Now, a few moments ago I mentioned that carbon credits are supposed to represent 1 ton of carbon dioxide emissions that were either removed or never emitted. Well, it's estimated that around 85% of all carbon credits are not reducing carbon, and there's research to suggest they actually increase emissions. As such, you could say the carbon credits market is not all that different from the crypto market, which is 85% shitcoins, probably. And just like with the crypto market, there are global regulations coming for the carbon credits market. During the UN's COP26 climate summit in Glasgow last year, 200 countries adopted Article 6 of the 2015 Paris Agreement. Article 6 of the Paris Agreement is a rabbit hole all of its own, but the main takeaway is that it will create a single global carbon credits market that an upcoming UN agency will regulate. This, quote, supervisory agency will also issue, quote, UN-recognized carbon credits to eligible institutions. As far as I understand, under Article 6, trades on the UN's global carbon credits market will be tax-free, meaning the global corporations will make an absolute killing. Now, here is where things get interesting. In case it wasn't clear, the goal of carbon credits is to reduce carbon emissions. This will be achieved by slowly reducing the amount of carbon credits that can be issued to companies each year. The European Union actually has a carbon credit reduction schedule on its website. Quote, "To increase the pace of emissions cuts, the overall number of emission allowances will decline at an annual rate of 2.2% from 2021 onwards, compared to 1.74% currently." Note, the EU carbon market is the largest. So, riddle me this. What happens when the supply of something gradually declines while the demand for it stays the same or gradually increases? That's right, prices will eventually rise. This is exactly what's been happening to the price of carbon credits, especially those in the compliance markets. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is how global corporations can ensure continued growth in the face of demographic decline. All it takes is a few billion carbon credits issued to them by their friends in government or at the UN, and a bit of supply and demand manipulation through regulation. Case in point, Tesla already makes most of its money by selling carbon credits, at least according to the mainstream media. Consider that Tesla is one of the largest companies in the world. Mark my words, it won't be long before we see the same economic phenomenon with other big brand names. So, as you might have gathered by now, the issuance, redemption and trading of carbon credits is something that has been limited almost entirely to regulated institutions. As a result, it's been extremely difficult for retail investors to get in on the 100x gain some of these carbon credit markets have seen. Luckily for you and me, we will have our chance to become carbon credit degens soon enough. That's because of the upcoming individual carbon credit scores you probably forgot this video was all about. Don't worry, I'm getting to them. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, Alibaba President Michael Evans revealed at the WEF's annual summit in Davos that they are working on an individual carbon footprint tracker. By they, I mean both Alibaba and the other so-called stakeholders who were on the panel and in the audience. Because Alibaba is a Chinese company, many people interpreted Michael's comments as meaning they were developing an individual carbon credit system that's akin to China's social credit system. This is why the video of Michael's comments went viral and why I used this interpretation as clickbait. Now, while it's true that some corporations are developing ESG scores that are analogous to China's social credit score, the individual carbon footprint tracker Michael and other WEF elites are obsessed about is something else entirely, and in many ways, it's much worse. This is because what almost all the countries at the UN are planning is the creation of an individual carbon credit market that's almost identical to the one that institutions have today. Each year, you will be given an allocation of carbon credits that allow you to emit a certain amount of carbon dioxide. And maybe how much carbon you're allocated will depend on your ESG score, but that's just speculation on my part. Note that everything I'm saying here has been researched by governments for years and is probably in development in most developed countries. Sources will be in the description. Now, if you use up your annual carbon allowance before the year is over by, say, eating too much meat or travelling too much, then you will no longer be able to do carbon-intensive things. That is, unless you purchase more carbon credits from individuals who haven't used up their annual allocation. If you're wondering how the government will prevent you from purchasing carbon-intensive things, the answer is a central bank digital currency, or CBDC. CBDCs are necessary for an individual carbon credit system to work, as are government-issued digital IDs, which are also prerequisites for CBDCs. More about CBDCs in the description. Moving on. As with the issuance of institutional carbon credits, the issuance of individual carbon credits will incentivize individuals to minimize their carbon emissions. At first glance, this seems fine, but upon closer inspection, it's easy to see why a carbon credit score is much worse than a social credit score. That's because in a simple social credit score system, you can still get ahead by being a good citizen. In a carbon credit score system, however, the only way you'll be able to live a good life is to purchase the carbon credits you need to do all the things a good life entails. This not only includes being able to go where you want and eat what you want, but also the ability to live in something that's not a plastic pod. For some of you, a good life will also include having children. Chances are you'll need a lot of individual carbon credits to do all of the above. This is especially because of something called Scope 3 emissions. Now, if you watched our recent video about SEC Chairman Gary Gensler's testimony, you'll know that Scope 3 emissions involve adding emissions that lie upstream or downstream from a company's operations to its own actual emissions score. Although Scope 3 emissions only apply to institutions right now, it looks like individuals will be next. That's because Michael mentioned that Alibaba and the other WEF stakeholders are working on, quote, Scope 3 emissions plus, which will indeed apply to individuals. This means that in an individual carbon credit system, you will probably have to provide enough carbon credits to cover the carbon emissions of, say, your friend who's travelling to see you. You might even have to provide enough carbon credits to cover the future carbon emissions of your children. Now, it should take you around 2 seconds to realise that this will make the poor poorer and the rich richer. The poor will literally live in pods and eat bugs so they can save up their carbon credits to sell to the rich for food and shelter. In turn, the rich will use these carbon credits to continue living as normal. To add insult to injury, the rich in this dystopian carbon credit economy won't even be the most productive. It'll be the insiders at the UN and those who own institutions that receive carbon credits from the UN. Note, I am entering speculation territory here, as we are years away from such a system. Now, if all that wasn't bad enough, recall that the purpose of carbon credits is to reduce carbon emissions. This means that we're more than likely to see the same decreasing issuance for individual carbon emissions as we do for institutional carbon emissions, and this has in fact been discussed. As you all know, this will make the price of individual carbon credits climb ever higher. That means it will be ever more difficult to afford the carbon credits you need to live a good life. It could even result in mass deaths as people try and conserve their annual carbon credits allocation to get ahead. Here is where things get seriously messed up, though. In an individual carbon credit system, a declining population is paradoxically a good thing. That's because if there are fewer people, then fewer carbon credits are being issued. This restriction in supply will further increase the price of carbon credits. This means that in an individual carbon credit system, it would be a literal race to the bottom, and the pace of this race will be very fast if individual carbon credits become interchangeable with institutional carbon credits. This is because global corporations would be incentivized to see demographic decline. Some would say they've already begun encouraging it, but let's not go there. So, this brings me to 3 big questions. When is this coming? How can you prepare? And can this insane system be stopped? Well, I'll start by saying that a small island off the coast of Australia has had an individual carbon credit system since 2011. It has a population of 6,000, so nothing serious. Yet. If you watched our latest VeChain update, however, you'll know that the European microstate of San Marino is using VeChain to set up its own individual carbon credit system in its mission to become the first country to comply with the UN's SDGs. It has a population of around 34,000, so it's a bit more serious. Based on this admittedly small sample size, we can assume that individual carbon credit systems will be rolled out in smaller countries first. This makes sense given that so far most of the research and development of individual carbon credit systems has been theoretical. More actual testing is needed. Beyond that, it's quite possible, if not likely, that we will see individual carbon credit systems introduced in the next couple of years. I suspect that the ESG-induced energy crisis will present the perfect opportunity to do this, as governments can use the allocation of limited energy as justification for the rollout. Let me repeat, ESG-induced energy crisis. Even so, individual carbon credit systems will not be effective until governments have rolled out digital IDs and CBDCs. I reckon it's safe to assume that the digital IDs will come first, given that governments have been not so subtly testing these during the pandemic. On that note, you might have heard of a recent article about an individual carbon credit system by the WEF, which blatantly states that the pandemic was a, quote, test for what's coming. I'll leave a link to that article down in the description. I'll also leave a link to our recent video about the WEF's Great Reset, where Chairman Klaus Schwab explains how the pandemic was a, quote, test of the Great Reset philosophy. Note that the WEF's mission is becoming increasingly indistinguishable from the UN's 2030 agenda. Even the dates line up. Anyways, as I mentioned earlier, governments will need to roll out both digital IDs and CBDCs for an individual carbon credit system to work. CBDCs still look like they're years away, but then again, you never know because central banks have been moving abnormally fast on that front lately. This relates to how you can prepare for such a system if it's successfully rolled out. Now, before I suggest anything, it goes without saying that I am not a financial advisor, and you should consult yours before making investment decisions. With that said, it looks like there are two hedges. The first is the most intuitive, and that's crypto or any other money that's outside of this system, so you can continue to transact without restrictions or carbon credit tracking. The second came as a eureka moment to me when I was researching this video, and that's to start accumulating the carbon credits you think you will need for the future. This includes making sure you have enough carbon credits for any children you plan to have and any other such Scope 3 plus BS. This second avenue is particularly appealing because the chances are that carbon credits will continue to go up in value, regardless of whether an individual carbon credit system is rolled out. This is simply due to the Ethereum-esque supply and demand dynamics. However, there are just 4 problems. The first is that it's not easy for individuals to invest in institutional carbon credits, and these are the only kind that currently exist. The second is that it's not clear whether institutional carbon credits will become exchangeable for individual carbon credits in the future. The third is that most of these carbon credits will probably end up being worthless. Recall that around 85% of them are estimated to be straight-up Ponzi's. The last thing you want is to go all in on carbon credits looking to make bank while hedging yourself against the UN and losing all your money in the end. The fourth problem is that the centralized control of carbon credits means the UN and others could set limits on how many carbon credits you're allowed to hold. If they're tokenized, then it would be very easy to set these kinds of limits. It would also be very easy to block transactions through CBDCs. This is why using a truly decentralized cryptocurrency as a hedge might be a better long-term strategy. A combination of both wouldn't be a bad idea either. However, this all assumes that the UN and its constituents will succeed in rolling out a global individual carbon credit system. Whether the UN succeeds with its sinister carbon credit scheme depends on whether it can get all its ducks in a row by 2030. This is when all these SDGs are supposed to be achieved. Now, history suggests that this is unlikely to happen, and the funny thing is that the UN finds itself in a similar situation today. You'll recall that the fallout from the 2008 financial crisis was the main reason why the UN's MDGs failed. Today, we find ourselves facing another financial crisis that has only just begun. This means that the full extent of the fallout has yet to come, and we're already seeing cracks form on the international stage. Again, for the UN's SDGs to succeed, it needs just about every country to be on board. This is becoming increasingly less likely by the day as conflicts arise between countries and nationalist candidates turn a cold shoulder to globalist organizations. Neither of the two extremes is good, by the way. Anywho, I cannot stress just how important it is that the UN gets every country on board. This is because if people can see that there are other countries overseas or even other states within a country that are not abiding by the SDGs, they might start to compare and contrast their quality of life. This is exactly what happened during the pandemic. Some countries and states implemented severe restrictions, and others did not. In the end, it's not clear what the benefits of these restrictions were, if any, because the outcomes were almost exactly the same. More recently, we saw Sri Lanka collapse under its own weight after it achieved one of the highest ESG scores the institutions could offer. This might have something to do with the fact that energy is the economy. Like it or not, but some amount of emissions is required for the world to function. This ties into a comment I made earlier, and that's that the only actual solution to climate change is to fix the financial system. Switching to a deflationary currency would incentivize saving instead of spending, which would drastically decrease the overconsumption that lies at the core of climate change. The only reason why we haven't done this is because it would make debt more expensive. This means all the governments that have borrowed trillions to buy votes would default and collapse, and all the elites that have borrowed trillions to buy up assets would be forced to sell and lose their imaginary wealth. Deflation would also force governments to be more responsible with their spending and force corporations to be much more careful with how much energy they use. Not a single law or regulation would need to be passed, and we would certainly not need a dystopian individual carbon credit system. This is all possible. All that's needed is the willpower to do it. Let's hope we find it soon. And that's all for today's video about individual carbon credit scores. If you found this information as alarming as I did, be sure to share it so that the info gets out. If you want to make sure you don't miss the next rabbit hole I explore, subscribe to the channel and ping that notification bell. If you want more from me, you can find me on Coin Bureau Clips and the Coin Bureau podcast. I'm also available on Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram, and push daily crypto updates on my Telegram. If you're wondering what I'm seeing in the markets and how I'm positioning my crypto portfolio, well, subscribe to my weekly newsletter to find out. And if you're looking for some of the best promos and discounts in the crypto space, then my deals page is the place, only for the viewers of this channel. You can find your way to all these resources and more using the links down below. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Till then, stay cool, stay safe, and stay crypto.